Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything.
Hello, and welcome back to A Year in the Bible podcast. My name is Katie, and today we are going to jump into Mark 6. Jesus is back in his hometown, and while Mark doesn't specify that it's his hometown, we know that he's referring to Nazareth. He's in his old stomping grounds doing what we've seen him do throughout Mark. He is teaching. And the people there, like many others we've seen, recognize Jesus' wisdom. And there's something different about the crowd's reaction to Jesus. They are a little put off by him. I don't know if you've ever known someone who became famous after you already known them. Maybe everyone loves them and you're thinking, I knew that guy in high school. They're fine, but they're not worth this kind of attention. Well, Jesus is now teaching amongst the people who watched him grow up. They can't deny his wisdom and his miracles. But where did this come from? Certainly not his family. And he trained to be a carpenter, not a teacher. Plus, Nazareth doesn't have the resources to produce someone like this. In short, they are not all that impressed with him. We know this guy. He's just an ordinary guy, they seem to say. And since they don't have faith in him, Jesus refused to do miracles among them. So he moves teaching from town to town. And then Jesus sends out his disciples. We've seen Jesus training these 12 men throughout the gospel, preparing to send them out, and now he does so. Notice that they are tasked with doing some of the things we've seen Jesus himself do. Preach a message of repentance, cast out demons, and heal the sick. Their ministry is an extension of Jesus' own ministry. Like Jesus, they shouldn't force themselves down people's throats. When people rejected him in Nazareth, he moved on. And in the same way, if a town wouldn't accept the ministry of the 12, they should shake the dust off their sandals and move on. A sign that those people have chosen to make themselves God's enemies. Now, between the account of Jesus sending his disciples and their return, Mark tells us about how King Herod threw a big feast for all of his high-ranking officials and had John the Baptist executed. The placement of this narrative here, after we've seen Jesus be rejected in his hometown and between sending of the 12, is ominous. It seems to be Mark's way of foreshadowing what will become abundantly clear later in this gospel, that being a disciple of Jesus is dangerous. It's costly. What happened to Jesus' forerunner will happen to Jesus, and what will happen to Jesus will happen to all of those who follow after him. We then come to two very important scenes, the first of which is the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus' disciples have returned, and he invites them to a remote place, that is, the wilderness, to rest. But a guy like Jesus can't stay hidden for long. The crowds find him, and then Mark writes that Jesus had compassion on them because they were like a sheep without a shepherd. In the Bible, that phrase can refer to God's people either being leaderless or suffering under weak leadership. In the previous scene, we watched Israel's official leader, Herod, throw a banquet for the rich and the powerful. But here, Jesus is shepherding the everyday people of Israel. He teaches them, and then he feeds them. It's important to mention Ezekiel 34 here. In that chapter, God responded to Israel's corrupt leadership by promising a future shepherd from David's family who would faithfully shepherd his people. Interestingly, God also says that he will be the one to shepherd his people, and that when a shepherd arises, God's people will live in safety in the wilderness. What God is showing us is that the feeding of the 5,000 is that Jesus is that shepherd, both human and divine, who would come to faithfully shepherd God's people, both in teaching them and in feeding them. He cares for those whom Herod has forgotten. By providing food in the wilderness, we once again see Jesus doing something that only God can do. And we get a similar example in the next scene with the disciples in the boat. This scene is familiar in some ways to Mark 4 when Jesus calmed the storm. But there are differences. First off, Jesus isn't initially with them. Second, while the disciples are having difficulty straining over the wind, they are in danger. So this isn't a rescue story necessarily. Well then, what's the point? Again, walking on the waves is something only God can do. And the language Mark uses of Jesus passing by them is important. In the Old Testament, when God would reveal himself to the people, he would pass by them. For example, when God is about to show Moses his glory, he speaks of how he'll pass by him. When God shows up to Elijah, 1 Kings 19:11 says that he passed by. Jesus is cluing them in on who he is. He is the divine. And if they grasp the significance of feeding the 5,000, that Jesus is like God himself, he provides for Israel in the wilderness, then him walking by the water shouldn't have surprised them at all. Jesus is showing them who he is. He is the Son of God, truly human and truly God. As we behold Jesus in Mark 6, notice the contrast between Herod and Jesus. Herod was a negligent leader. Jesus took care of the people. Herod threw himself a birthday feast, focusing all on himself. Jesus' feast in the wilderness was about serving others. Herod's feast was exclusive, only for the elite. Jesus' feast was for all people. And Herod's feast led to death for John. Jesus' feast was life-giving. The people had more than enough to eat. Jesus is the true shepherd and the better king we have always longed for in our hearts. He gives us what we need, and he cares for us. My prayer for you this week is that you marvel at Jesus' care for his people. In today's chapter, he faithfully fed those who were like sheep without a shepherd. He again proved his power over the elements by walking on water. And if he can provide food for 5,000 and walk upon water, he is surely enough to take care of you. Lay down your anxiety and trust in his care for you today, friend. See you tomorrow for chapter 7.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.